Recrystallization is the process by which one can purify a solid material by heating it up in a solvent. It dissolves in the solvent, then as it cools back down again, because it's less soluble in the cold solvent, the crystals come back again, but hopefully in a more pure form, especially if you let the crystals form slowly and without any kind of interference. But you can add to the process by doing a hot filtration in the middle of that. In other words, heat your solid up, dissolve it in a liquid, filter it while it's still hot. That gets rid of any insoluble materials that may not dissolve in the hot solvent, contaminants, and then let it cool back down again, filter out the crystallized form, and hopefully any contaminants that are soluble in the cold solvent will stay behind when you filter it. So we're going to demonstrate by using some benzoic acid, and we're just going to use water as the solvent because it's the most convenient, most inexpensive, least toxic, and so on. Now, in many cases, you can't get away with that. You have to use some other solvent or perhaps a mixture of solvents. But in this case, I've taken my benzoic acid and I've added some cold water to it. Now I'm going to heat up my hot plate. While that's heating, I'll show you the other equipment we'll use besides the benzoic acid or whatever the solid material is in water. I'm going to add a couple of boiling chips to this because I actually want it to get hot enough to boil the water. We also have another flask that's going to also have water in it, just plain water. A very little bit, not a lot, just enough to fill the container with steam. And I'll add a couple boiling chips to it as well because we want that water to be boiling. And then on top of that flask, we will have a stemless funnel, that is, doesn't have a long stem in it, and a piece of paper that's folded. Perhaps the easiest way is simply to fold it in half once, fold it in half again so you have a quarter, and then open 1/4 of it so that 3/4 of it are on one side and 1/4 on the other side. It opens up to a nice cone, and put that in there. And I'm simply going to spray that with a little bit of water to get the paper wet. And of course that will just drip down into the container that already has water in it anyway. And then my third flask, I'm just going to have as a reservoir of hot water that I can use as rinse water for both the flask and any crystals that might form in the filter paper. And I will add some boiling chips to that as well. Now we're going to put all three containers on the hot plate. The one that has our solid material to be recrystallized in the solvent, the one that has a small amount of water in the bottom and a filter on the top, and, by the way, a watch glass on the top. So when this is boiling, it's going to fill this whole container, including up into the funnel, with steam so that it will stay nice and hot. And I'm also going to have my reservoir of water ready on the hot plate as well. And now we'll just sit and wait till it starts to boil. One thing to keep in mind is that as that solvent is boiling, it's going to make the flasks hot. So there's a neat little trick you can do using just a piece of paper toweling, fold it over a few times, and it makes a nice little strap by which you can pick up the hot flask without burning your fingers, and at the same time it serves as a nice handle for pouring. Now you can see there's already the water's boiling in that flask, and the steam is rising up into the funnel, and the inside of the funnel is getting nice and steamy, and the paper itself is very wet and very hot with boiling water. This flask is just beginning to get hot because there's a little bit more water in there, and I don't know if you can see it or not, but quite a bit of that solid has dissolved. Not all of it yet by any means, so we'll keep waiting. This flask is boiling nicely, steam is rising up into the funnel nicely, and droplets are actually forming on the watch glass. If the water in here seems to be disappearing, we can always add a little bit more just through the funnel to replenish that. And notice now that the water in this flask is boiling nicely, and the solid material in there, the benzoic acid, completely dissolved. So now it's time to filter through the filter paper. Pour that that into the funnel. Watch brass back on. Pour a little bit of hot water from our reservoir into the flask to rinse it. Heat it up till it's nice and hot boiling. Pour it through the funnel as well. Don't set an empty flask on the hot plate. You need to make sure that there's always water or some other solvent in the flask when you set it on the hot plate. Now you may notice as you're doing this that a few crystals have formed inside the filter funnel. So I'm just going to pour a little bit of hot water through there to dissolve those crystals. You don't want to ever use too much water because you want to make sure your crystals will come back again. And if you put in too much solvent, it may be that they become completely soluble in the solvent. I'm just going to let that water filter through. And I think we're ready. So I'll just take this off the hot plate, set it on the table to cool down. And I will turn off the video at this point because it's going to take a while for that to cool down and form crystals. We'll be back when the crystals are formed. Welcome back. Notice that after some time, and the elapsed time is a couple hours, notice that we now have beautiful crystals in the bottom, all ready to filter out. Of course, there are still boiling chips in there, so those would have to be picked out after filtering it. But typically at this point then you would do a suction filtration. But these crystals are now much purer than they were when we started.